In this video, I'd like to look at a quick little JavaScript program, a web page on JavaScript and a little CSS. And the emphasis will be on the two sort of timing methods that JavaScript makes available. The code for this demo can be found at the URL seen. Okay, so show you the HTML and the CSS quickly, and then the focus will be on the JavaScript. But let's just open it up with a live server here. So here is my one little image with an image of a die face, and I have a button. I click the button, and it changes the value of the die sort of randomly and repeatedly, but eventually stops. So the roll stops, and then I can roll again. The button is disabled so that it cannot be clicked while that rolling is occurring, but then it sort of is re-enabled when that is done. So we'll talk about why that is. So that's the simple design, and then mouse. So here is the HTML, the head, the title, an HTML comment, and a connection to a style sheet. And there's not much stuff. There aren't many elements, so there's not much style. And then on the page itself, there's a header. We have an image tag where the source for when we start is the die1. So there are some images. Let me see if I can find those quickly for you. They're not that exciting. There they are. I have a bunch, and I'm just referring to the images by their file name, and that implies that they are sort of siblings. They are next to the JavaScript and the HTML, which they are. Okay, so there was an image. I gave it an ID so that I can access it in code. I did not give it an alt, so I'm bad on accessibility for this guy. Apologies. The source is the image that will be seen, and I gave it a little inline style here. This could have been in my style sheet, but I put it here inline. Okay, and then here's the button I used. And for my button, I used an input of the button type. The value is what the button says, and I didn't have any on click, so I'm going to use an event listener in the JavaScript, but I have an ID button roll, and then I have a connection to my script. The style, I styled the body, so there was the background color and the font color, just color. I used a Verdana as my main font, and my main font, and that's of the sans serif family, and I worked with a text-aligned center. Centering is not always easy. Sometimes it's complicated, but this one just seemed to, that seemed to be enough to just put everything in the middle. The input was the button, and so there is my background color for my button, and I made the font extra large rather than specify some specific number, just extra large. Now the JavaScript, that is our focus. So this program has two timers. There are two types of timers. So this demos two types of timers available in JavaScript. So we will have both types of timers. We will start both types of timers, and we will stop one of the types of timers. Okay. Okay, so at the top of the code, I have declared two variables for the timer IDs. So when you start a timer, when you use the method to start a timer, it returns an ID for that timer. And if you want to control that timer in any way in the future, then you need to be able to identify it And so you must sort of store, you must keep a variable with the value of that timer ID. Now I'm going to do this for both timers, although I'm never going to do anything with timer ID 2. It's just sort of in principle, one might want to. And so I'm sort of, for fullness sake, I don't know, declaring it, but I really won't I will grab its value and then do nothing with it. Timer ID will be important. Timer ID 2, not so. I don't need this Explorer. Okay. So there was an element of the input type on the other page, which had an ID of button roll, and we're giving it a click event with the method StartRoll. And here, and also here when we're using the timers, when we refer to a function, when we say we're going to relate this function to an event, in this case, a user event of clicking, and then later we're going to have relating functions to our timer events. You do not put the functions open and close parentheses. If you have the open and close parenthesis, it kind of like invokes the function right away, rather than say with the timer or with the clicking, we want it to wait until the event. So we want it to wait for the timer event to call it. Okay, so, but this is so line 5 here is the connection between the user's click event and the function StartRoll. So now that makes us responsible for defining StartRoll, and here it is. setInterval is establishing a timer. It is what I'm going to call a repeating timer. So it has, in this case, two arguments. The first one is a function that we're going to call what it is, and that in that function we will find what it is we want to do. And then the second argument is a number of milliseconds that go by before we call the method again. And then we call the method repeat it. We call this method again and again, and we're going to call it every 100 milliseconds or every 10th of a second, provided that, you know, what we are doing in that a method can be done in that amount of time. So if we gave it too much to do, then we might have sort of overlapping methods, or they might take longer. But this is sort of how long, you know, provided that I can accomplish all these things in 100 milliseconds, then I will sort of have another turn and do it again, and do it again, do it again, do it every 100 milliseconds or every 10th of a second. Okay, so this setInterval is the sort of key, the method, the key word that sort of establishes a repeating timer. We say the function it wants to call, and we're going to call that roll, and we're going to call it every 100 milliseconds. JavaScript allows us to have not only multiple types of timers, but even the same kind of timer, say this repeating timer, it would allow us to have more than one. And so, and that can wreak havoc, especially if I only have one timer ID. I can only then identify one of those repeating timers. And so then when it comes time to stop the timer, I'm only stopping one of the timers. So I want to prevent myself from making more than one repeating timer. And I do that by disabling the button. So StartRoll is called by the button. If in that function I disable the button, the user won't be able to click the button again and get additional timers that are going to confuse the situation. So that is the purpose of this, to go to the page, get the item with an ID of button roll, which was obviously the button, and set its disabled property to true, stopping the user from clicking the button again, which would make more timers. And then we are establishing the second type of timer, I'm calling it the once and done timer. So the set interval repeats itself every 100 milliseconds. This is what we do. The set timeout is a different kind of timer. It is a timer that waits for the time parameter, and then at that time calls this function. So it does this once. It waits the amount of time, in this case, 1000 milliseconds or 1 second. And after 1 second, it will call the function StartRoll. Okay, so again, the repeating timer, set interval, and the sort of once and done timer, set timeout. And I'm getting the ID from these. So I'm getting the ID of the interval timer, and I'm also getting the ID of the set timeout timer. I'm going to work with timer ID 1. The other one I don't really use. It's sort of unnecessary for this program. Okay, the repeating timer calls a function roll. So that's where I go next. What does roll do? So this is the repeating thing. This is the getting the random number and showing the dice sort of a number of times in a row. And so I have declare a variable for the die value, which I called outcome. I am getting a random number between 1 and 6. Let's start in the parentheses here. I'm using the math library, JavaScript's math library, to get a random number that's between 0 and 1. I'm multiplying that by 6, so that's giving me a random number between 0 and 6. I'm adding 1, that's giving me a random number between 1 and 7. And it never gets to 7. I should say it's, exclusive. It doesn't get to 7. And then I'm taking, once I get that, then I'm using again the math library and taking the floor, taking the sort of integer value. So I was getting, with this, a random number between 1 and 7, not including 7. And then when I took the floor, I was getting an integer then had up to 1 to 6. And so that was my random die value. I'm using the word die plus that variable plus GIF, concatenating that together. That formed my file name, and I set the src property, the source property of the image element to that. And so that's why I was showing different images. So that's what my repeating function does, and it gets called repeatedly every 100 milliseconds. And then that was the set interval. The set timeout calls StartRoll. And StartRoll is going to use the set method, the method clearInterval. And clearInterval takes the timer ID of an interval timer. So we're clearing an interval timer, that hence the word interval here. So we're clearing a repeating timer, and we're clearing the repeating timer with an ID of timer ID. That was declared, I'll call it globally. It's established in StartRoll, and it is then used in StartRoll. So to make sure that the different functions have access to that variable, that's why I declared it outside of the functions. I didn't initialize it here, but I declared it here. And that means StartRoll will have access to it to initialize it, and StartRoll will have access to it to use it within clearInterval to stop the timer. So I'm stopping the repeating timer. I don't have to stop the once and done timer because it's done. It only happens at once it sort of You can, there is a clear timeout method. So if you were waiting a long time and you wanted to sort of cancel it, like that time did not go by, but you want to cancel whatever it is you wanted to do at the end of that time, it's possible to sort of clear this sort of once and done timer. I'm not in this program, but it is possible. But okay, but back to what it actually does do. StartRoll takes the timer ID, which was global, so it's available, and stops the interval timer with that. So that stops the repeating behavior. And then to be able, I disable the button so then I didn't get multiple timers going. I have the two types of timer, but I don't have multiple timers of the same type going. But if I want to be able to roll again, I should set the disabled property of the button to false. So I should be able to sort of, I'll say, enable the button once again. Okay, that's what I wanted to show you in this example, the two types of timers available in Java.